I'm an independent IT contractor and I do web programming largely. So what am I going to bore you with for the rest of this afternoon then? Well, there's this little language that's come out with Microsoft called TypeScript. It's not a new language, it's been around quite some time now in fact. But I'm going to show you that there's a world in the front end for those of you who still like dealing with C# in the back end. Now, can I just have a quick show of hands here? How many of you are still doing C# and haven't yet come into the browser? Right, I'm afraid I'm probably going to disappoint most of you then, because this talk is largely aimed at those folks who are still doing C# and who want to go from C# and want to go into the browser. Okay? Now, hopefully you will get some use out of it. But I apologise if I make any of you fall asleep. It's just a natural talent I have. So what this talk is not about, I'm not going to teach you TypeScript as a language, and I'm not going to be taking some massive big applications and showing you how to convert them. Please note, I'm partially deaf. I wear hearing aids, so if you've got a question, unless you're jumping up and down in the audience and waving your hands around like you don't care, then I'm probably not going to answer you. It's not because I hate you, it's because I genuinely don't know that you're shouting at me. If you've got any burning questions, feel free to come up at the end of the session and I'll do what I can to answer them for you. If you want to stalk me on the social interwebs or anything like that, there's my stalking details. And without further ado, if you want to play along, pop this, I keep forgetting I've got this thing, pop this into your devices and that will bring up the TypeScript Playground. Everything that I'm going to show you, you will be able to type into that and you will be able to get instant feedback as you play around with the code. So, why might we want to use TypeScript? As a C# developer, to answer that question, we first have to ask this one. Why would somebody who does C# for a living and probably has a very good living doing it be bothered about front-end client development? Now, I'm not going to do the show of hands thing again. We've already done a show of hands for this afternoon there, so we'll move on from that. Why go front end? It's no surprise that pretty much every application that we see these days is running in the browser. On top of that, the world of IoT, kettles, toasters, anything you can imagine of, most of these things have Node.js sat inside of them. A lot of them have tiny little embedded V8 engines that are not exactly Node.js, but they're based on the V8 engine. TypeScript can build code for all of these things. So when I say making the move to the front end, it's not really just the front end. It's actually moving into the back end as well. However, to be fair, most back-end systems now are becoming more and more API orientated. When was the last time, well, if you're doing back-end, a lot of you probably are still doing Razor and MVC, things like that. But if you are doing front-end, when was the last time you actually did any C# code that produced HTML, that produced an actual web page? I know certainly myself in the past 2, 3, maybe even go back as far as 4 years now, I've pretty much only been writing APIs. And I know a lot of my peers have as well. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that this time next year there won't be a role for back-end developers, but you certainly need to have it in your vision that there's options to expand. With the rise of AI and other such systems as well, a lot of back-end code is now becoming increasingly more automated. You're seeing systems that are getting built that can look at a database and just build your application code for you. And everything that your clients see is in the browser. So your client is looking at your browser code and they're thinking, well, that's my application, not this running here on the server, because they don't see that sat behind the scenes. So you really do need to start, wrong button, you really do need to start looking at TypeScript seriously. Other reasons why you might want to take a look at it, Anders Hellsberg. That is a name that should be familiar to many .NET developers, especially if you've been around for a while. He's the guy that wrote C#. And he knows a thing or two about languages. For those developers in here that are ever so slightly younger than I, he also wrote a very great language about 10, 15 years or so ago called Delphi, which was probably one of the first OOP languages ever available to produce Windows applications in. Once you get into it, it is a very productive language. If you're used to C#, it looks like C#, or it can look like C#. There are minor differences, you'll see some of them in a minute. But once you've got the TypeScript tools installed, it is super easy to get up and running. Personally, I like to use Visual Studio. You don't have to use Visual Studio. A lot of people I know that work with TypeScript use MS Code. Now, for reasons of time, because this is quite a short session, I'm not going to bring code up and I'm not going to load Visual Studio because we'll be here all afternoon. But you can use any tooling that you want with it. So what exactly is TypeScript? Well, there you go. That line sums it up in its entirety. Okay? TypeScript is JavaScript. It's not a new language, it's not a different language, it's not something that is not JavaScript. You can put normal, regular JavaScript inside your TypeScript files, and it will treat them just like it will treat the TypeScript. Now, the advantage there is you can mix and match. So if you've got existing JavaScript code in your line of business applications, you can take this code, you can drop it into a new TypeScript file, and then you can start adding TypeScript code around it. And it's just seamless migration. It has Visual Studio Language Provider extensions. So if you've got TypeScript in a project and you're running in Visual Studio, or your organization is using Visual Studio, then your TypeScript build set automatically becomes part of your MS Build C# build script. It's an ES6 transpiler. Now, can I have a show of hands? How many of you are familiar with the term transpiler? Yeah? So I'm assuming then a lot of you know what Babel is. Yes? Cool. Well, TypeScript does some things that are very, very similar to Babel, but it's not Babel. Whereas Babel has an extra compilation step, TypeScript is more like an interpreter. In fact, if you're using the new Microsoft SPA templates that come with .NET Core and using the .NET New from them, you will actually find that it has Webpack in the core of it. And when you do your build with Webpack, the TS files get put in your bundle. And as your application requests the JS from Webpack, Webpack will use its TypeScript plugin and it will compile it on the fly while it's delivering it to the browser. And this is what enables you to do all the new hot module replacement and be able to change all your code in TypeScript and your backend while the entire application is still running in .NET Core, completely live. It's a nice feature, by the way, but don't ever try and make changes like that while you've got something running on production because it will bite you. I speak from experience. So, if you've never actually come across TypeScript before, there are a few misconceptions that routinely get thrown about. TypeScript is slow. No, it's not. As I've just said, it's JavaScript. So if you've got crap TypeScript code that's running slow, well, I'm sorry, but it's because you've written crap code in the first place. Or you're using some library, some NPM. You know, I mean, we all know that NPM's just full of viruses and malware these days, right? It requires expensive Microsoft tools to use it. No, it doesn't. Like I've just said, Visual Studio Code. Who's a Sublime user? Who's an Atom user? We all have our preferred development. Hell, I've even SSH'd into remote servers halfway across the world and used the Vim text editor at the command line to edit TypeScript projects. You have to learn a completely new language. Nah, we've already covered this one. Okay, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but JavaScript is JavaScript is JavaScript. So if you don't have to learn a new language, and if TypeScript is JavaScript, then why the hell do we need TypeScript? Well, TypeScript is there because it makes your journey as a C# developer to the front end easy. If you understand C#, if you understand OOP, if you understand classes, if you understand inheritance, TypeScript will do all of that for you. And that's what makes it so uniquely placed to make the front end make sense to C# developers. There's even frameworks out there that look and feel like WinForms. So if you're doing desktop development using WinForms, if you're using web forms, even if you're using bog standard MVC and Razor, there is frameworks, there is tools out there that will emulate that environment for you, and a large proportion of them are on GitHub. A simple search will find you tons of stuff. And again, it's all about keeping your workflow, keeping you where you are familiar, and dealing with the stuff that you're already dealing with every day. Bit more repetition there. So, we've covered that side of things. Now the next question. From a language point of view, why does TypeScript exist in the first place? Okay, TypeScript originally came about to provide type safety to JavaScript. Now, we all love type safety in C#. One of the reasons why we like C# is because you can't even blow your little toe off. But those of you who have done any raw native JavaScript stuff without TypeScript will know that it's ridiculously easy to blow your entire foot off with JavaScript without even trying. And what's more, it's possible to do that without the JavaScript interpreter even telling you that there's anything wrong with your application. So, types. TypeScript is smart. It can infer your types. So if you use a variable in a specific way for a specific purpose, let's say you assign a string to it or a number to it or something like that, and you then try to go and do the classic JavaScript trick of assigning a different type of content to that variable, it will fail. It will tell you, no, you can't do that, you're a bad programmer. Types are defined pretty much exactly the same way as they are in C#. The only difference mainly is that the type, where it comes after the modifier in C#, has to come after the variable name in TypeScript. Okay? So this is your magic syntax here, the colon. That's what sets your type. So this here as you can see quite clearly, that is a string type. If I then tried to put a 0 in that or set it to a Boolean, that code will fail to compile. You can also have something called union types. Now, there's a bit of a love-hate relationship with these things. Some people like them, some people hate them. They should really be called Marmite types, perhaps. But because of the underlying JavaScript ability to have any type assigned to any type, it is sometimes needed to be able to say, well, I want to do a string and a number on a specific thing. But how do I do that and still keep the type safety that TypeScript gives me? You use a union type. They were initially called type guards, but they've renamed them. And the idea here is quite simple. Let that variable, it's a string or it's a number, give it anything else, it'll bitch. So, classes. Dead simple. Again, it is almost identical to C#. If you can do object-oriented programming in C#, you can do object-oriented programming in TypeScript. Again, your variables are defined with the type following them, whereas C#, the type is in front of them. This undefined thing here, undefined and null, are still usable in TypeScript. But please don't use them. The TypeScript team are working hard to try and find a way so that we don't have to use null and undefined. The problem still hasn't been fully solved yet. There are some modifiers. They have got a couple of new features in the latest 2.7 release that are sort of a stopgap to fill that in. But if you can, set your variables up the same way you might do it in C# or the same way you might do it in C++. Always assume that to uninitialize something is going to be very dangerous and everything will be wonderful. The other thing you need to note is this public. So we all know that in C#, public means that that class is available publicly on your API. We've got internal, we've got private, we've got various others like sealed. In TypeScript, you have public, you have private. That's it. Nothing more. But if you want to make a class available to something like NPM or Modern.js or System.js or anything like that, you need to export your class. And there is a little bit of a difference here. Now, I don't actually have an example of this up on any of the slides. I apologize for that. But if you've seen an import statement, you'll know that you can get them in two different versions. You have the import, curly brace, and the name of the module that you want to import, curly brace, from, and the file to import it from. Or you can have the import without the curly brace. If you have it without the curly brace, then what it will assume is it's looking for a default. If there is no export default class, or the default is not present on the modifier list, it will not work with the non-curly brace syntax. If you do have the curly brace syntax, then you've got to give it the name of the class that you're looking for. So it's all about modular programming. You can extend, so you get inheritance as well. Double colon for C#, extends keyword for TypeScript. Yeah? Other than that, the semantics are identical. Constructor, this is one other difference that will bite you. Whereas the constructors in C# are public named after the class name, in TypeScript you have to use constructor. And to be fair, that's not a TypeScript thing. That is actually modern JavaScript. That's your ES6 syntax. Your constructor has to be called constructor. Now, in previous releases, sort of pre 2.1, 2.2, if you had a constructor in your base class and you were deriving from that base class, you had to call super. to call the constructor in the base class. That you don't need to do now. There are still a few gotchas. I need to refresh my own memory on that, so I'm not going to go into them here. But this is crossed out because it will no longer cause a build step. If you're working with an older TypeScript transpiler, however, and you try to do something like this, it will complain, it will break your build step. It won't just give you a warning, it'll stop compilation. And if you've got this running as a step in MS Build in a larger C# project, then it will kill your project build as well for the back end. Access to property members within your classes in TypeScript, you must use this. There's no inferred access. So if you have a piece of code and you access one of your properties and that's not available either locally or globally, again, you will get a build error. So this is important. Don't ever forget that. TypeScript also has something called modules, which are largely very similar to namespaces in C# world. That is how you do a module. The syntax, again, is very, very similar to C#. Not a huge amount of difference. If you can do C#, you can do this. There is a bit of a dark side to this, and it will bite you, however. Beware of the length of your module names. TypeScript classes or namespaces modules do not have an equivalent to the using syntax. So if you've got using system.net, using system.collections, whatever, there is no such thing in TypeScript. If you're using long module paths in your namespaces like that, then every time you want to refer to that class to new up an instance or use it, you have to use that thing in full. Now, I don't know about you, but I subscribe to Scott Hanselman's school of thought on this, that a developer's fingers only have so many keystrokes in them. And once they're gone, that's it, game over. So, this is probably one of my favorite features of TypeScript. We all use generics in C#, yes? Show of hands? Yes? Everybody knows what generics is? Fantastic. Generics in TypeScript allow you to do generics in JavaScript. What's not to love about that? And the syntax is, again, largely identical. There's your C# version. And this is, by the way, this is a bit bigger screen than I'm used to working with, so if I keep sort of going like that, you'll have to... right, so that's my C# version. And you can basically see that I'm implementing that with the types, with that there, with the string modifier. Hang on, have I missed something here? Oh, no, I haven't. Okay, so, yes, right, okay. I haven't read my notes, obviously. So this is the TypeScript version of it. And you can see that the syntax is exactly the same. So this will look familiar to anybody who's done C#. That'll look familiar to anybody who's done C#. Here is your magic sort of word. So this, like the extension when you're inheriting from classes in TypeScript, that is how you make use of your interfaces when you're doing generics. I'll leave it up to you to come up with some more complex examples of that. But if you really, really, really want to challenge yourself and do some really gnarly work with generics in TypeScript, try writing yourself a client that consumes the Twitter XML API. It's fun, but it's not fun. Right, so all this leads to ES6. So many of these features that I've showed you here are part of modern JS. Now, I don't know how long you've been doing web development, but I certainly remember what it was like to do HTML4. Hell, I even remember HTML2 and 3 in Netscape Navigator. And I really have no desire to ever go back to doing anything like that. ES6 and TypeScript are bedfellows, and they are very, very good bedfellows. Everything that the ES6, the ES7, and the modern JavaScript standards track seek to implement, Microsoft is going to try and implement in TypeScript. Why is this a good thing? I mentioned Babel before. If you're used to Babel, you will know that the idea behind Babel is to take modern JavaScript and use it in old browsers, largely speaking. With the TypeScript interpreter, there's no configuration files to do this. There is a simple command line option, -ES3, -ES5, -ES6, so on and so forth. If you have to target IE9, IE10, or anything like that, simply put the -ES5 flag on your TypeScript compiler line in your build step, and you're going to get ES5 compatible JavaScript code spat out the other end, right? If your client then says, you know what, we're not going to use IE anymore, we're just going to go Chrome, Firefox, and all the lovely modern stuff, all you then have to do is go in your build file, take that command line flag off, hit build, job done. No changing of code, no nothing. If you want to know where ES6 is going, keep that in your bookmarks. I actually have this on my bookmark bar in Chrome because I look at this practically daily. ES6 one's full now, but there's ES7, there's ES8, so on and so forth. I think they've started renaming the URL as well to JS 2015, 2016, whatever. But certainly, go to this GitHub repository here, take a look at it, follow the links. That will tell you what does not work, not only in TypeScript, but in Babel, in the different browsers, in V8, in whatever the hell Firefox are calling their JavaScript engine, and I think Microsoft is the Spartan Core, something like that. It's got all of them listed on it. Highlights of ES6 and all stuff that TypeScript supports. Lambdas. Okay, again, if you're doing C#, Lambdas are something that should be completely familiar to you. And if you can do Lambdas in C#, you can do them in TypeScript. Default parameters, exactly the same as in C#. You set your parameter on the function proto, and then if that is not provided, that will be the value that is provided to your call. Now, there is another small gotcha here that you have to watch out for. I haven't actually got it up on screen, but you can make a parameter optional but not put a value on it simply by putting a question mark after it. If you put the question mark there, you cannot then make it a default parameter. So you can't do both at the same time. You can't say a flag equals false and have the question mark on. But by the very nature of putting a default parameter on and not putting the question mark on, it marks it as default anyway. So doing it that way, you don't need the question mark. But if you don't want to provide a default value, you must put the question mark on. Definition files and external libs. So it's all very nice having this lovely language that allows you to do OOP and it allows you to do C#-like syntax in the browser, but you still want to be able to use jQuery and Moment and whatever the library of the month is. Well, that's done by using definition files. They're actually called ambient definitions, but they also have another use. As well as just being a definition file that allows you to include a third-party JavaScript library that wasn't written in TypeScript in your code, they also allow you to make your own definitions. And this comes in useful for things like interfaces. Now, you saw just a moment ago that I had an example up there of an interface file when I did the generics thing. If you use interfaces and you model your types using interfaces, but if you put your interfaces into files with this extension, the TypeScript compiler, transpiler, will not try to turn them into JavaScript code. What it will do, however, is it will provide type safety for you. And if you're using Visual Studio or Microsoft Code or something that understands IntelliSense, it will even give you IntelliSense on your types. So even if you don't have to have a concrete implementation of your object, it certainly is very well worth making interfaces for any types that you have coming across from your C# code and putting them in .d.ts files. There are even extensions in the Visual Studio gallery. One of them I think is called cross object or something like that. I can't remember the name of it, but there's a number of them that you can plug into your build step. And what they will do is they will look at the C# objects that you have in your code, and they will make .d.ts ambient declarations on the fly for you. So that all you have to do is build your C# object, and then when your AJAX request comes through to your API to get an object from the back end, you will be able to deserialize that JSON in the front end and still have that type safety in your front end code. Many of the common libraries in use, jQuery, Moment, and again, whatever the flavor of the month is, are available here. Now, they actually had to eventually open their own website. The story behind this is they used to run on GitHub, but there was that many definitions got added to the library in such a short space of time that GitHub's code base couldn't cope with it. And they actually had to truncate the file listing in the root GitHub repository to 10,000 items. Now, think about that for a moment. This had to be truncated at 10,000. There was at least, to my knowledge, another 70 or 80,000 after that, and then some. Last time I looked at definitelytype.org, which was just before Christmas, there was somewhere in the region of 250,000 user-contributed packages available for just about every third-party JavaScript library that you can imagine. To get them into your project, these are your three primary methods. However, TSD and typings are actually being phased out in favor of using the @types syntax for NPM. Now, you may also have noticed that things like Angular and a couple of others have started using this @syntax as well to not only get types, but to refer to things where libraries might be linked with each other's and certain different types of attributes, things like that. It's something new that NPM have put in. I don't pretend to know anything about NPM. I type these commands and then I sweep it under the carpet and get rid of it. So the point here is that's the recommended way of doing it. Okay? The other two will still work. They won't let you down. If you've got them in an existing build or an existing project, they'll continue to work, as far as I'm aware. But for new deployments, that's the way to do it. If you are using Visual Studio and you're a NuGet fan, then when you search for jQuery, for example, tag it with TypeScript. So put tag:*TypeScript, then a space, then the name of the package you're looking for. And what you will find, as well as it matching the others, it'll also look for TypeScript definitions that are tagged with TypeScript. This is part of the standards. If you're going to submit a TypeScript definition to definitely typed, they insist that you tag it with a TypeScript tag, because that enables you to find it in NuGet as well. If you're using Web Essentials, which you should be if you're web developers. That's a puzzled look, Chris. Right, okay. Visual Studio Gallery. If the only thing you take away from this session is to go home, fire up Visual Studio and look for the Web Essentials stuff and its derivatives in the Visual Studio Gallery, then you really should do that. There is a whole plethora of extensions which will automatically compile less, automatically compile SAS, run JSLint, run TSLint, and just about anything else you can imagine. Most of them are built by, I forget his name, he's a Swedish guy, he's just insane for doing HTML5 stuff. He's one of the Microsoft guys. And you'll spot them all because he's got one big super meta package to install all of these. I'm not going to go into that anymore because I'll stand here singing its praises for the rest of the afternoon. But if you have it installed, then that's what you need there. Okay? Right-click on a JavaScript file that you have in your scripts folder in your project, and you should have a menu item that says that. So that brings me to the summary. Do I really need to summarize what I've told you? Well, you can read this if you want, or we can just skip over largely what I've already said. I mean, even Angular have rewritten in TypeScript. The Aurelia, hands up who uses Aurelia? Anyone? Yep. Aurelia, if you haven't looked at it, please go and look at it. Let's stop using Angular. It's horrible. Okay, now I realize I'm going to get lynched when I get outside for saying that, but truly, everybody that I have said, go and look at Aurelia to, and compare it to what you're doing in Angular, have come back to me a very short time later and gone, where's this been all my life? Why am I using Angular and not this? So even if you don't want to change and you love Angular and you're a complete Angular fanboy, at least go and take a look at it. It really is a very nice framework. But this is not my Aurelia talk, so we're going to move on from there. TypeScript is supported left, right, and center. It's Microsoft. It's GitHub. There's no shortage of materials for it. And if you've got to this point and you're still awake, I'm not. This is the robot that was here this morning. There's my stalking details again. I'll make a PDF of these slides available. Keep an eye on my Twitter stream, and there'll be a link to it when I actually get back down north, because as you may have noticed, I'm a Geordie. Don't hold it against me. I apologise for coming and polluting your stage with that. But please do retweet our sponsors, because without them, I wouldn't be standing here telling you all about this good stuff. Thank you.